ASMR video. Today, as requested by one of my viewers, we will take a look at a song which is called Gangsta Rap. And then there's a title which I can't really say because as a white person, well, that wouldn't really go so well. So instead of saying the N-word, which is a reoccurring word in this song, we will be switching that word out to the word neighbor. Without further ado, let's delve into the song. Yeah, motherfucker. Sup, neighbor. Gangsta rap, neighbor. Neighbor. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. I'm 100% neighbor. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. I'm 200% neighbor. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why do police hate neighbors? Neighbor, 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 neighbor. They hate us because our dicks is bigger. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why do you call yourself a neighbor? Neighbor, 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 neighbor. 'Cause I'm a motherfucking neighbor. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why do you drink so much beer? Neighbor, 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 neighbor. I don't drink beer. I drink malt liquor. 'Cause I'm a neighbor. I'm a motherfucking neighbor, man. I ain't all that African American shit. Fuck that. I'm a neighbor. I ain't mixed. I'm a neighbor. N-I-G-G-A. Neighbor. You already know. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why you eat so much chicken? Neighbor, neighbor. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why won't you make it in my kitchen? Neighbor. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why you call them hoes bitches? Neighbor, 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 neighbor. 'Cause them hoes is bitches. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why you stay in the hood? Neighbor, 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 neighbor. 'Cause I don't like living by Peckerwoods. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why you ain't got no job? Neighbor, 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 neighbor. $7 an hour won't feed me, dog. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why your pants gotta sag? Neighbor, 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 neighbor. 'Cause hand-me-downs is all a neighbor has. Neighbor, 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 neighbor. Why you scared to go to court? Shit, is a neighbor. Do-rag is a neighbor. Ballistics is a neighbor.